Good afternoon. So today our story starts with Prince Aeson of Logos, as he's kneeling beside his wife, holding her hand as she pushes and screams. Giving childbirth in ancient Greece is a difficult thing, and to add to the stress, there were men coming to kill Aeson. Moments earlier, a servant loyal to Aeson had stepped into the room to announce that the king, Aeson's father, had just died, and that Prince Peleus, Aeson's half-brother, was the new king, and coming to secure his kingdom for good, for once and for all. King Aeson had to act quick. Once the child was born, he handed the child to the servant and told him about a secret exit to the cellar that would lead him out of the castle, and about a cave in the forest that someone lived where he could find help. Now, you may not recognize the origins of this story, but you may recognize the title and the quest. This is the humble beginnings of Jason and the Argonauts. This is a fantastic story in Greek mythology, and we'll discuss Jason's adventure to retrieve the golden fleece for King Peleus. Also, the crew, some of the famous Argonauts, which were named after Jason's boat, the Argo, and what the quest was about, and the sad and misfortunate death of Prince Jason. So back to the story. As the servant approached the cave, he noticed that this wasn't an ordinary cave, but a well-lit and inviting home. To add to that, there was a centaur standing at the entrance. Now, if you're not familiar with Greek mythology, centaurs are basically half man, half horse, with the upper body, the torso of a man, and the lower half of a horse. Now, generally, centaurs are considered wild and violent beasts, but this one, he was a little bit different. His name was Chiron. You can kind of think of Chiron as Beast from the X-Men, where he's mildly terrifying to look at, but he's extremely intelligent and well-spoken. So Jason was raised by Chiron for 20 years until it was time for him to return to his homeland, Locus. On that trip, he had a few different adventures, and in a long string of events, he was eventually invited to a feast by King Peleus once he returned back to Locus. After a few discussions with Jason, the king discovered that Jason was his nephew that he had believed long dead over 20 years ago. Now, due to the strict customs that were involved with hospitality in ancient Greece, Prince Peleus would normally have just had Jason killed on spot, but because ultimately he would suffer the wrath of Zeus, what they believed to be the wrath of Zeus, upon killing a guest that was invited into your house, he ended up having to let the young man live. And at that point, Jason discovered that his father, King Aeson, who he thought was dead for 20 years, had actually been alive and imprisoned by King Peleus. So the two worked out a deal, King Peleus and Jason, where Jason would be sent on this somewhat impossible quest to retrieve the golden fleece from a land across the sea called Colchis. Now, there's a long backstory that's involved with why the Greeks would want to have this golden fleece brought back into their land. We won't go into that, but it is a very interesting story on its own. So once Jason found out this was going to be his quest, and that upon his return with the golden fleece, that his father, King Aeson, would be freed, and that Jason, would actually take the throne of Locus. So Jason would eventually put together a powerhouse team of what was described as Argonauts, or called Argonauts. And like I said earlier in the story, Argonauts are basically just taken from the name of his ship, the Argo, and it consisted of 50 men, some of which you may have heard of, Hercules being one of the main characters of the Argonauts, to include Philistocles, Peleus, not the King Peleus, Telamon, Orpheus, Castor, and Pollux, Atlanta, Euphemus, and by some accounts Theseus, even though a lot of the timelines don't necessarily match up with Theseus's his myths and stories associated with him. So once that crew sailed away from Greece, it was a multi-year voyage where they had lots of different adventures. They fought witches, sirens, giant bronze, automatons, and a vast assortment of deadly creatures. Some of the men lived, like Hercules, and came back to finish his 12 labors, while most of the other kind of unknown men died on the adventure. Just to give you a spoiler alert, to cut the story a little bit short, Jason actually did retrieve the Golden Fleece, returned to Leucas, and was eventually crowned king, and the old King Aeson was freed. Peleus at the time was sent into exile within the town to include all his family members. So one of the interesting things was that Jason didn't accomplish a lot of these tasks and adventures alone, and not necessarily solely just with the help of the Argonauts, but he also had help from his wife. So on Colchis, he met and married the king's daughter. Her name was Medea. She was a witch by some accounts, to where she would cast spells and help out, and she would eventually help Jason defeat the sleepless dragon that guarded the Golden Fleece. Now, on the return to Leucas, Medea, hearing about the misfortunes of King Aeson, decided that she was going to take it upon herself to take revenge on King Peleus, or the former King Peleus, where she tricked his own daughters into killing him by cutting his body into pieces and mixing him in with a stew. And that was done through a little bit of sorcery and a little bit of trickery. Years later, so after that happened, Jason and Medea were basically sent into exile. Even though he was the king, the people were very upset about that, sent Jason and Medea into exile, where they lived for many years, raised a family in another kingdom, and eventually Jason was bored of his life, where he was friends with the king, King Creon of that land, and he befriended him and attempted to marry the king's daughter, the princess, while he was still married to Medea. So Medea, being kind of her somewhat evil self, decided she was going to take revenge on the king and his daughter by basically lacing a wedding dress that she sewed with a potion that would set skin ablaze once it was touched by human flesh. So again, Jason was exiled from that land by the people, being upset that their king and their princess had just been killed. And this was really the ultimate downfall of Jason. He would lose everything after that. He would lose his house, the small fortune that he amassed. He'd lose his wife and his children. And in some accounts of the story, Medea is actually the one that killed the children in front of Jason, just to kind of deliver that final blow to him. He would ultimately live the rest of his life as a peasant and a beggar, and die on his broken down ship that wouldn't even sail anymore, in a rainstorm. It sunk in a rainstorm, tree fell on top of the ship, and that's how he died. So now, understanding this was just a glimpse of the life of Jason and the Argonauts, this is an incredible myth, a Greek story that I encourage everybody to read about and research on your own. We only really skimmed the surface, and there's a lot of peripheral adventures that the crew goes on, in addition to the quest itself. So Jason was, of course, able to avenge his father's imprisonment and take his place on the throne, if only for a short while. And if this was a Hollywood story, it probably would have ended there, but the Greeks didn't really concern themselves with happy endings for the masses. So Jason would grow from a brash young man with a devil-may-care attitude to an aging prince in exile who was constantly worried about glory and legacy. And I thank you for listening.